Welcome, sleepy souls. I am your storyteller, Mr. Dread. Tonight, I'm here to help you drift into deep, peaceful sleep. But before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. And if there's a story you'd like to hear next, I would love to know that too. Every doll has a soul, but some are hungry. The rain pounded against the glass windows of Jonathan Blackwood's study, each drop like a soft, persistent drumbeat echoing in the cavernous room. Outside, the streets of Boston glistened under the amber glow of street lamps, their light reflecting off puddles like fractured shards of memory. Jonathan, a man of precise tastes and unnerving curiosity, ran his fingers over the surface of the latest acquisition, a porcelain doll seated in a velvet chair, its eyes unnaturally bright, almost alive. He had discovered it in a dusty corner of an obscure antique shop hidden in a narrow alleyway he had never noticed before. The shop had smelled of mildew, old paper, and something else, something faintly metallic and warm, like dried blood. The shopkeeper, a hunched old woman with sharp eyes, had said nothing as he paid. She only nodded, her thin fingers lingering on the doll's hand as if transferring a silent warning. Jonathan was no ordinary collector. Dolls had fascinated him since childhood, not as playthings, but as repositories of something profound, almost spiritual. He kept them meticulously arranged in glass cabinets, each one catalogued and documented. Their expressions, their posture, the way their eyes seemed to follow him, all of it mattered. Yet, something about this one felt different. The doll's hair was a perfect auburn, braided in tiny, intricate plaits. Its face was painted with such realism that for a moment, Jonathan swore he saw it blink. He shook his head and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling in his glass. That night, as the storm raged outside, Jonathan sat in his armchair, cataloging his new doll by the dim light of a single lamp. He felt an odd compulsion to study it, to observe it in detail, as if it were demanding his attention. And then he noticed it, the faintest movement in its mouth, like the corners had twitching life of their own. Brushing it off his fatigue, he turned away, but a chill ran down his spine. When he looked back, the doll's eyes seemed wider, its lips slightly parted, revealing a hint of a smile. Jonathan's heartbeat quickened, but he convinced himself it was his imagination. Dolls didn't move. Dolls didn't breathe. Dolls didn't. A soft sound interrupted his thoughts, a low, almost imperceptible giggle. Jonathan froze, glass in hand. The room was empty. The rain beat down harder, hammering against the roof. He leaned closer to the doll. Nothing. Just porcelain, just painted eyes, just the velvet chair. And yet, he felt watched. The next morning, news spread through Boston like wildfire, a child had gone missing. Mary Ellis, 6 years old, vanished from her home without a trace. Her parents were frantic, the police baffled. Jonathan followed the story with a detached interest at first, until he saw the description of the girl's favorite toy, an oddly familiar doll with auburn hair and braided plaits. The hair. The face. His stomach knotted. He rushed to the antique doll, only to find its expression subtly altered. Her eyes now mirrored the terror reported in the missing girl's photographs. The corners of its mouth lifted ever so slightly, a grotesque mimicry of glee. Jonathan's breath caught. He wanted to dismiss it, to rationalize, but the unease rooted itself in his mind. Something about this doll was alive, and somehow, it had a connection to Mary Ellis. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, lights off, shadows pressing close against the walls. The doll remained in its chair, silent but watching. And then, faintly, he heard it again, a whisper. "Take me with you." Jonathan shivered, a cold sweat breaking across his forehead. The words seemed to echo from the doll's mouth, yet when he leaned in, the porcelain lips were still. The house felt colder. The shadows deeper. And the sense of being observed stretched into every corner of the room. Unable to resist, he reached toward the doll. Its hand was icy, far colder than porcelain could ever be. His fingers brushed against it, and for the briefest instant, he thought he saw the surface ripple, like flesh under the porcelain. He recoiled, stumbling backward. From the corner of his eye, he glimpsed movement. A shadow detached itself from the wall, small, human-shaped, and darted behind the curtains. Jonathan's pulse raced. Something had entered his home. And it was not alone. The night dragged on, each hour marked by whispers, the faint scraping of tiny feet, and the soft, almost musical laughter of the doll. Jonathan sat in his chair, paralyzed with fear, yet unable to look away. The doll's eyes were no longer just glass, they were intent, knowing, hungry. And as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Jonathan realized the horrifying truth: he had not bought the doll. The doll had chosen him. As the sun rose, Jonathan's phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. "One more doll has joined your collection. Will you find her, before she finds you?" Jonathan couldn't shake the dread that gnawed at him like a persistent, invisible worm. The message on his phone burned in his mind: "One more doll has joined your collection. Will you find her, before she finds you?" His hand trembled as he set the device down, the dim morning light casting long, skeletal shadows across the study. Each doll in the room seemed to regard him differently now, their painted eyes glinting with subtle malice, as if acknowledging some unspoken pact. He forced himself to breathe, to tell himself it was a cruel prank, but the memory of Mary Ellis haunted him, her wide eyes frozen in terror, the grotesque mimicry of her expression mirrored in the doll's face. A knot of fear tightened in his chest. What had he brought into his home? He spent the morning inspecting his collection, cataloging each figure with meticulous care, yet each one seemed slightly altered from memory, a tilt of the head here, a sharper curve of the lips there. It was as though they had shifted in his absence, rearranging themselves into some configuration he could not decipher. Jonathan's rational mind insisted it was exhaustion, imagination, perhaps the lingering residue of a bad dream. Yet, deep down, he knew better. The dolls were aware. They were alive. By evening, his unease had metastasized into a visceral terror. He poured himself a drink, trying to anchor himself to the mundane act of swallowing amber liquid, but it did little to calm the rising panic. That night, the house seemed to breathe around him. Floorboards groaned as if carrying invisible weight, shadows crept along the walls with unnatural fluidity, and the faintest whisper of movement emanated from the glass cabinets. Jonathan's gaze returned repeatedly to the newest doll, its auburn hair catching the pale lamplight, its eyes glinting with a hunger he could not quantify. He told himself to sleep, to rest, to ignore the impossible truth pressing at the edges of his mind, yet sleep refused to come. Hours passed in an oppressive silence, punctuated only by the occasional scuttle of unseen feet and the occasional, chilling click of porcelain against glass. Then, just as he felt he might descend entirely into madness, Jonathan heard a sound that stole the air from his lungs, a child's voice, soft and trembling, calling his name. "Jonathan. Jonathan," the syllables echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. He rose, heart hammering, and followed the voice to the doorway of the study. It was coming from the room where he had first set the auburn-haired doll. The doll sat in its chair, serene and lifeless, or so he thought. Then the whisper came again, unmistakable this time: "She's here." Jonathan's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he reached for the doll, lifting it carefully. There, tucked behind its folds of velvet clothing, was a tiny, folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Written in delicate, looping script were 3 words: "Find her first." Panic surged through him. The implication was unmistakable: Mary Ellis, or someone else, was now trapped somewhere, and he alone held the key. But how? And why? Unable to bear the silence, he moved through the house, checking every room, every closet, every shadowed corner. The air grew colder with each step, the faint metallic tang of fear mixing with the smell of the dolls, a nauseating combination that churned his stomach. In the nursery, the rows of dolls on the shelves seemed to lean slightly forward, their eyes fixed on him, following his every motion. And then he saw it, a new doll he did not remember acquiring, sitting upright on a rocking chair. Its face was unmistakably that of Mary Ellis, down to the terrified widening of the eyes. The tiny hands were painted to grip the edges of the chair, the porcelain lips parted in a scream frozen for eternity. Jonathan staggered back, heart pounding so violently he thought it might burst from his chest. He remembered the shopkeeper's fingers brushing the doll, the subtle transfer of something unseen. The realization struck him like a physical blow. The dolls were not mere toys. They were vessels. And Mary was inside one of them. Desperation clawed at him, a fierce and unrelenting force. He ran to the study, grabbing his notebook, furiously scribbling observations, connections, anything that might make sense of the horror before him. He noted every subtle change in the doll's expressions, every tilt of a head, every glint in their painted eyes. Patterns began to emerge, tiny, almost imperceptible alterations following every reported disappearance in the city. Whoever, or whatever, was orchestrating this was meticulous, deliberate, and terrifyingly intelligent. A sudden sound made him freeze, the soft click of porcelain against wood. He turned slowly, and there, moving impossibly, was the auburn-haired doll. Its head tilted toward him, eyes glinting with that same insatiable hunger. For a moment, Jonathan thought it was imagining it, that sleep deprivation had warped reality. But the faint, almost musical giggle that followed confirmed it. It was alive. The doll's hand lifted slightly, beckoning him closer. Jonathan wanted to run, to flee into the night, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He realized, with a cold, horrifying clarity, that the dolls were not just mimicking life, they were replacing it. And the process had begun with Mary Ellis. Whoever, or whatever, had crafted these dolls had plans, and he was now entangled in them. The night stretched on interminably. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of movement seemed amplified, a constant reminder of the invisible presence stalking him within his own home. The dolls sat patiently, their painted faces serene, yet Jonathan felt the gaze of countless hungry souls trapped behind those eyes, waiting. And then, as if the house itself exhaled, a sound like the opening of a door came from the attic, a slow, deliberate creak that promised something terrible awaited above. Heart-hammering, Jonathan climbed the narrow, groaning stairs, each step threatening to betray him to whatever waited above. The attic door loomed, shadows pooling beneath it, the faint outlines of shapes pressed against the walls like living stains. His hand reached for the latch, trembling violently. The moment he touched it, a deafening silence fell, and then, from the darkness, a single, delicate giggle rang out, echoing in the corners of his mind. And then he saw her, another doll, one he had never purchased, sitting perfectly upright on a dusty trunk. Its eyes, unmistakably alive, glowed with recognition. Mary Ellis had been replaced. Jonathan stumbled backward from the attic, the words echoing in his mind like a chorus of despair, "You can't save her, but you can join her." His breath came in ragged gasps, and the air in the house seemed impossibly thick, as though every shadow were pressing in on him, squeezing, judging. He forced himself to glance back at the doll on the trunk. Mary Ellis's features were flawless, innocent yet distorted, a grotesque echo of the child who had once lived. The eyes, wide and glimmering, seemed to plead silently, trapped in some silent scream Jonathan could feel but not hear. He realized with growing horror that these dolls did not just capture likenesses, they captured essence, stolen moments of life itself, sealed into porcelain and paint. His mind raced, desperate for some rational anchor. What kind of monster could create dolls capable of such unnatural mimicry? How had this creature remained hidden for so long? Jonathan's hands shook violently as he descended the attic stairs, eyes darting to every shelf, every cabinet. Each doll seemed to shift imperceptibly as he passed, their eyes tracking him with uncanny awareness. The tiny giggles and whispers had not ceased, they had multiplied, layering over one another like a chorus of malevolent spirits. In his study, he rifled through old records, old auction catalogs, anything that might give him a clue. He remembered the shop where he had found the auburn-haired doll and a detail he had dismissed at the time, the shop's name, Marionette and Company, etched faintly on the brass plaque above the door. A chill ran down his spine. The name Marionette had been whispered in hushed tones in obscure collector circles, legends of a dollmaker who had vanished nearly a century ago. People said he was obsessed with perfecting his craft, to the point of sacrificing life to preserve beauty. Most dismissed the story as folklore, an eerie urban legend. Jonathan now realized it was real. Every doll in his collection, every missing child, every new arrival at his doorstep, this was the work of a living nightmare who had transcended death itself. He dug further, finding old newspaper clippings and journal entries hidden in the city archives. Each tale was identical, children disappearing without a trace, always followed by the sudden appearance of a lifelike doll, the features of the lost child captured in terrifying accuracy. Some reports hinted at a shadowy figure who had been seen near the homes of the missing, always dressed in dark, tailored clothing, face obscured by the brim of a hat. And then, buried deep in a brittle, yellowed diary, Jonathan found the final entry of the dollmaker himself: "Perfection cannot die. I will collect until the last breath, until every flicker of life is captured in my creations. The dolls are hungry, and so am I." The words burned themselves into Jonathan's mind. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to destroy the dolls before he too became part of the collection. Yet a darker, more insidious curiosity held him rooted. The dolls were intelligent. They were patient. And they were hungry. What did it mean to join them? The shopkeeper's fingers brushing against the auburn-haired doll now made sense, a silent handover, a passing of a curse that Jonathan had unwittingly accepted the moment he paid for her. Night fell like a suffocating blanket. The house creaked and shifted as though breathing with him, shadows pooling and stretching in unnatural ways. Jonathan lit candles, their flickering flames casting dancing specters on the walls. He examined each doll again, noticing subtleties he had missed, the way the eyes seemed to glisten with tears that were not there before, the almost imperceptible twitch of fingers poised for some action beyond their porcelain form. Whispers rose from every corner, unintelligible yet insistent, a soft, seductive chorus promising power, immortality, and horror. Suddenly, he heard it, the delicate sound of footsteps, impossibly light, ascending the stairs. His heart leapt into his throat as he froze. The auburn-haired doll remained seated on the velvet chair in the study, its eyes gleaming with a predatory intelligence. Jonathan realized with dawning terror that the steps did not belong to any living person, they were deliberate, precise, and undeniably artificial. As they approached, the candlelight flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the walls and writhe in anticipation. A single word slithered through the room, whispered in a voice both ethereal and tangible: "Join." Jonathan staggered back, eyes wide with realization. The dolls were not merely vessels, they were the extension of the dollmaker's will, fragments of his consciousness, each doll an extension of his hunger, his obsession. And with every new acquisition, his essence grew stronger, reaching out through the delicate porcelain to claim those who dared cross his path. The final revelation struck Jonathan like ice: the dolls were patient because they had all the time in the world. Time meant nothing to the dollmaker, and now, through them, he had found a way to bypass mortality, to ensnare the living into a twisted, eternal tableau of perfection. Panic surged, a tidal wave of dread and adrenaline. If he stayed, he would become one with them, a perfect statue trapped forever in porcelain, his essence feeding the immortal hunger that had now set its sights squarely on him. Jonathan fled from the study, barreling down hallways lined with silent, gleaming faces. The whispers followed him, rising in pitch, growing desperate, accusing, commanding. He reached the front door, yanking it open to the stormy night, and paused. Outside, the street was empty, yet every shadow seemed alive, every puddle reflecting shapes that should not exist. From the corner of his eye, he saw a doll sitting upright on the porch, her features unmistakably human. A new addition. Someone he recognized, had already been taken. The wind howled around him, carrying a faint, lilting giggle that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jonathan understood then that running was futile. The dolls were patient. They were intelligent. And the dollmaker was eternal. His only choice was to survive long enough to understand the rules of this nightmare. But even as he clutched at his sanity, one thought refused to leave his mind: how many of the missing had been here before him, and how many of them now watched silently from behind the glass eyes of the dolls? Jonathan's heart raced like a drum of impending doom as the doll in the doorway remained unmoving, its eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that no human could replicate. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and wind shrieking through the eaves, yet inside, the house was eerily silent except for the soft scrape of the doll's feet on the wooden floor. Each step it took was deliberate, measured, as though savoring his fear. Jonathan's mind screamed at him to run, to flee into the stormy night, yet every fiber of his body felt frozen in place, trapped in the gravitational pull of the doll's gaze. For the first time, he truly studied the figure before him. Its posture was unnervingly lifelike, its movements fluid, almost organic, yet impossibly precise. The porcelain sheen of its skin glimmered under the flickering candlelight, but there was no doubt in his mind, this was no ordinary doll. The auburn hair that framed its small, perfect face shimmered with an almost unnatural radiance, and its eyes held a depth, a sentience, that chilled him to the core. And then it spoke, though the words seemed to form in his mind before leaving its lips. "We've been waiting for you, Jonathan." The sound was not just auditory, it reverberated inside his skull, pressing against his thoughts, tugging at his sanity. His stomach churned, a mix of nausea and terror, as he realized the voice was familiar yet alien, like echoes of long-forgotten memories he could not place. What do you want from me?" he stammered, his voice barely audible over the wind that rattled the window panes. The doll tilted its head, a mockery of curiosity, and in a whisper that seemed to travel through the walls themselves, it said, "Everything. Your time, your fear, your essence, and your perfection." Panic overtook rational thought. Jonathan lunged for the nearest object, a heavy brass candlestick, and swung it at the approaching figure. The doll moved with impossible speed, sidestepping with uncanny grace. The metal struck the floor with a clanging echo, but the doll remained untouched, its expression unchanging, its eyes unwavering. Jonathan staggered backward, heart pounding, realizing with horror that no physical attack could harm it. These creatures existed outside the rules of the living, untouched by brute force, driven by a will older and darker than he could comprehend. Breathing heavily, he retreated toward the study, desperate for some plan, some strategy, some lifeline of logic. The dolls in the cabinets seemed to shift as he passed, tilting their heads, leaning forward, as if aware of his fear, as if the movement of his pulse dictated their next action. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a cacophony that clawed at his mind. He felt himself teetering on the edge of collapse, his thoughts fracturing under the relentless psychological assault. And yet, somewhere deep in the recesses of his mind, a spark of determination ignited. He would not be their victim. He would not become another frozen figure among the porcelain faces of the damned. Jonathan scrambled through the study, rifling through his notes and journals, desperate for any clue, any weakness. He remembered the diary of the original Dollmaker, "The dolls are hungry, and so am I." The words pulsed in his memory like a heartbeat. Hunger. That was the key. The dolls, these abominations, craved something, life, essence, fear. Perhaps understanding their desire gave him leverage, a sliver of hope to exploit their unnatural need. And then it moved again. From the corner of his eye, he saw the auburn-haired doll leap onto a table with a speed that defied logic. Its tiny, delicate fingers clutched the edge as it tilted its head to regard him with a predatory curiosity. Jonathan's pulse surged, he backed into the far wall, trying to maintain distance. In a flash of intuition, he realized something crucial: the dolls needed proximity, needed attention, perhaps even acknowledgement of their presence to exert control. If he could avoid their gaze, he might buy himself time. But the effort of averting his eyes from those impossibly alive faces was nearly unbearable. A sound behind him drew his attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like nails on wood. He turned slowly, his stomach lurching, and froze. More dolls had emerged, sliding silently from shadows, their forms eerily lifelike, faces twisted into expressions of innocent malice. He counted at least a dozen now, each one more grotesque and precise than the last. Their eyes glimmered with anticipation, tracking his every twitch, his every breath. He realized with cold, sinking certainty that they were not just mimicking humans, they were anticipating him, predicting his moves, waiting to corner him in the perfect tableau of fear. The largest doll, impossibly tall, advanced first, its footsteps silent against the creaking floorboards. Jonathan gripped the candlestick tighter, his knuckles white, every muscle tense for flight or fight. And then the whispers began again, this time forming words, phrases, threats that he could almost understand if he concentrated. Your essence, your fear, join us, perfection. The voices overlapped, an unending litany that pressed against his sanity. Desperation clawed at him like a living thing. He realized he had no choice but to confront them directly, to force a reaction, to test the limits of their hunger. With shaking hands, he flung the candlestick at the nearest doll, not to destroy, but to provoke, to see if the movement would elicit any response. The doll recoiled slightly, tilting its head as if confused. Jonathan's heart raced. Confusion? Could the dolls feel such a primitive emotion? He seized the moment, lunging past them, sprinting toward the stairs leading to the cellar. Maybe in the darkness below, he could find something, anything, to fight back with. As he descended, the whispers intensified, voices melding into a single, maddening chant that promised terror and immortality simultaneously. And then, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crack, plunging him into darkness. The only sound was his ragged breathing and the faintest, cruelly sweet giggle that echoed from above. Jonathan fumbled for the light switch, only to realize with a shudder that the cellar was illuminated by dozens of dolls, each seated on shelves and crates, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, expressions frozen in twisted delight. The dolls had anticipated his flight, herding him into their lair, a shrine of hunger and obsession. And at the far end of the cellar, a figure stepped out from the shadows, impossibly human in size yet unnervingly still, the auburn-haired doll, now towering, her eyes blazing with a life that defied comprehension. Jonathan froze, knowing that this confrontation was only the beginning. He was no longer merely an observer, he was prey, ensnared in the meticulous, eternal design of a master collector who had long since transcended mortality. The words echoed in Jonathan's mind like a death knell, "Welcome to your new collection, Jonathan. Let the perfection begin." Every nerve in his body screamed for flight, yet his feet remained rooted to the cellar floor, as though invisible chains bound him to the looming horror before him. The auburn-haired doll, no, the creature that had once been a child, now something infinitely worse, stepped closer, each movement precise, deliberate, almost predatory. Behind it, the shelves teemed with lifelike figures, their painted eyes glinting, their tiny hands poised in unnatural stillness. The air was thick with the metallic tang of anticipation, the scent of old wood, wax, and something else, something far darker that coiled in the back of his throat like smoke. Jonathan's gaze darted frantically around the cellar, searching for anything to exploit, anything that could give him leverage against this nightmare. That's when he noticed the faint lines etched into the floorboards, subtle grooves forming intricate patterns he had never seen before. They seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. He crouched, running a trembling finger along one of the grooves. As he did, a chill ran down his spine. The lines were arranged in a complex pattern, a lattice that pulsed faintly under his touch, almost like veins beneath skin. He realized, with a mounting sense of dread, that this was no ordinary cellar, it was a trap, a crucible, a conduit for the Dollmaker's method. He remembered the diary he had uncovered, the ancient entries that spoke of perfection and hunger. The Dollmaker's process had to involve more than simple mimicry, it had to be a form of extraction, a way to capture not just the appearance of life, but its essence, its soul. Jonathan's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of his observations, the alterations in the doll's expressions, the correspondence with the missing children, the whispers that seemed to emanate from the porcelain itself. Each disappearance was followed by a subtle transformation, a shifting in the doll's features, until the stolen life was fully encoded in the delicate curves of clay and paint. And then it hit him, the method was psychological as well as supernatural. The dolls fed on fear, on anticipation, on the slow, creeping terror that invaded the mind before the body was claimed. Every heartbeat, every gasp, every desperate thought strengthened the transfer, empowered the vessel, and prepared it for the next phase. The dolls were patient because they had to be. They collected not only bodies, but the essence of terror, weaving it into their being until they became something far more than lifeless toys. They became extensions of the Dollmaker himself, immortal and insatiable. A faint scuffling sound brought Jonathan's attention back to the towering auburn-haired doll. Its head tilted slightly, and he realized with horror that it was studying him, analyzing him, reading not just his movements but the very tremors of his mind. He tried to move, tried to think, tried to summon a plan, but the realization sank like lead. He was no longer merely being hunted. He was being assessed, measured, and prepared for the final transformation. Each doll in the room, each perfect porcelain face, was a witness, a participant in his fate. Jonathan's hand instinctively went to the small pocket knife he always carried, a trivial weapon against such inhuman forces, but even its presence gave him a fleeting sense of control. He lunged toward the nearest doll, hoping to break it, disrupt the ritual, force some reaction. The doll jerked backward with impossible speed, its head snapping to him with a grotesque, uncanny grace, and a voice, thin and melodic, echoed in his skull, "Perfection cannot be destroyed. Only joined." He stumbled back, realizing that brute force was meaningless. The Dollmaker's creations were beyond destruction, beyond conventional rules. And then Jonathan noticed something chilling. The doll's eyes glimmered differently when he focused on them individually, as though each one contained a flicker of life, a remnant of the person it had consumed. He had glimpsed Mary Ellis, yes, but there were others, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each frozen in eternal torment behind those glassy orbs. His stomach churned, bile rising as he understood the enormity of the horror. This was no isolated curse, this was an endless, patient harvest, spanning decades, perhaps centuries, sustained by the relentless hunger of a single, immortal creator. Driven by a mixture of desperation and grim curiosity, Jonathan edged toward the far wall, where he remembered seeing old crates stacked haphazardly. With shaking hands, he pried open one and discovered the most horrifying evidence yet: more dolls, some incomplete, others with features grotesquely distorted, hints of their previous lives etched into their forms. A small doll lay among them with a familiar braid, the unmistakable hair of a boy he remembered from a missing persons report 6 months prior. The doll's expression twisted in silent agony, the eyes glinting with unspent terror. Jonathan's mind reeled. He was looking at the physical proof of the Dollmaker's immoral work, the method he had perfected over decades: extract the soul, encode it into porcelain, and perpetuate his consciousness indefinitely. The realization was suffocating, but Jonathan's survival instincts flared. He had to escape, to understand the rules fully, to find a way to outwit the collector who had defied death. But as he turned toward the staircase, the auburn-haired doll blocked his path, accompanied by several others now emerging from shadows like predators closing in on prey. Their voices intertwined into a singular thought, penetrating Jonathan's mind with a clarity that made his blood run cold: "You belong to the collection now. All that remains is your perfection." Jonathan's breath caught, his mind spinning. Every step, every heartbeat, every flicker of fear was being measured, stored, absorbed. If he stayed, he would become another piece, another doll in the endless gallery of the Dollmaker's obsession. And yet, a tiny ember of defiance sparked in him, a desperate hope that perhaps the method had a flaw, a vulnerability that the collector had overlooked in centuries of meticulous work. He had to find it, or he would be lost forever. And then, from the shadows at the far end of the cellar, he heard the faintest click, like porcelain striking stone. Another doll had joined them, small, deliberate, and smiling with a grotesque perfection that chilled him to his core. The whispers coalesced into one final, terrifying thought as the room darkened around him: "It is time to begin, the perfection awaits." Jonathan's pulse thundered in his ears as the auburn-haired doll stepped closer, porcelain fingers reaching toward him with a precision that made his skin crawl. He could see the glint of something unnatural in her eyes, an almost liquid luminescence that pulsed with hunger. The other dolls had moved as well, forming a semicircle around him, each one smaller yet equally terrifying, their eyes alive with the stolen essence of previous victims. The cellar felt impossibly alive, as if the walls themselves were bending inward, breathing in tandem with the Dollmaker's centuries-old will. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet his legs trembled beneath him as though the house itself were holding him in place. The whispers began anew, layered and insistent, crawling into his skull like tendrils of smoke. At first, they were soft, teasing, seductive in their promise, perfection. Join us, fear is a gift, your essence, your perfection. Jonathan tried to cover his ears, tried to drown them out with frantic gasps and muttered prayers, but it was no use. The sound was inside him, vibrating within the very fibers of his mind, forcing visions of his own face being transfigured into porcelain, his flesh cooling, his eyes widening with terror, frozen forever in a dollmaker's gallery. A cold wind swept through the cellar, carrying with it the faint metallic scent that always preceded the doll's movements. Jonathan backed against a crate, pressing his palms to the splintered wood as he tried to focus on some tangible reality. But reality had shifted. The dolls were no longer merely physical, they were extensions of something far older, far darker, something that had studied fear for decades and had perfected its consumption. The auburn-haired figure reached out, and when her fingers brushed his arm, Jonathan felt a jolt like electricity mixed with icy fire. Pain, terror, and a strange, seductive warmth coursed through him all at once. His vision blurred, and for the first time he felt it, the pull of the dolls, the seductive tug of the collector's method. His body was not yet fully consumed, but the process had begun. Tiny fractures appeared in his perception of himself, edges of his identity splintering like cracks in glass. The whispers intensified, now punctuated by faint, melodic giggles and the faint brush of porcelain against his skin. Jonathan screamed, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive darkness, and tried to shake off the feeling, to run, to resist, but every step, every movement, seemed to feed their power, accelerate their work. The auburn-haired doll's hand hovered inches from his chest, and in that instant, Jonathan glimpsed the truth of the method. The dolls did not merely capture the body, they harvested fear, desperation, and the essence of life, weaving them into porcelain and paint. The victim's soul was not merely trapped, it was transfigured, split, and encoded into the figure, leaving only a hollow, terrified vessel behind. He realized the whispers were more than sound, they were a psychic siphon, a thread that pulled the consciousness of the prey directly into the waiting form. Jonathan stumbled backward, falling against a stack of crates, and a smaller doll leapt from the shadows, landing perfectly upright on the topmost box. Its tiny porcelain fingers brushed his knee, and in that touch, he felt the echoes of other lives, screams swallowed and frozen in clay. Each connection, each stolen essence, seemed to anchor the doll's power, creating an invisible lattice that bound them together and gave the dollmaker a reach across time itself. His stomach churned, bile rising, as he realized the scope of the horror. Mary Ellis was not unique, nor the other victims. He was witnessing a process perfected over decades, each soul another brushstroke in the collector's immortal portrait of terror. Desperation forced him to act. Jonathan scanned the cellar for anything that could disrupt the process, some weak point in the doll's method. His eyes fell on the intricate grooves etched into the floor, the lattice pattern that pulsed faintly under the candlelight. Perhaps the pattern was a conduit, a focus for the doll's power. Perhaps disrupting it could break the psychic siphon long enough to escape. Summoning every ounce of courage, he grabbed a nearby crate and hurled it at the largest doll, shattering a shelf and sending smaller figures crashing to the floor. The dolls froze momentarily, eyes widening in synchronized shock, and Jonathan lunged for the nearest groove, smashing it with a heavy crowbar, hoping the disruption would be enough. The effect was immediate. The whispers faltered, the psychic pull weakened, and the auburn-haired doll staggered, her perfect posture cracking for the first time. Jonathan felt the tug on his essence ease, just slightly, and adrenaline surged through him. He realized that this was the first step, the first opportunity to fight back, but the relief was fleeting. The other dolls began to converge, not in panic, but with a patient inevitability that promised they would persist, adapt, and continue the process. The collector's will was not confined to the cellar, nor to the doll's physical forms, it was eternal, pervasive, and hungry. Jonathan staggered backward, chest heaving, mind racing. The process had begun, yes, but it was not complete. If he did not act, if he did not find some leverage, he would become another silent figure, another perfect doll in a gallery of eternal torment. He knew now what he must do. He had to understand the collector, the method, the origin of this ancient obsession, before it claimed him completely. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of the cellar, he sensed that the Dollmaker himself, if the entity could even be called a man, was observing, patient, calculating, and infinitely hungry. Jonathan's breath caught as the shadow in the far corner of the cellar coalesced into something unmistakably human. A man emerged, impossibly tall and unnaturally still, dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed to absorb the flickering candlelight. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a hat, casting a deep shadow over features Jonathan could not see, yet he felt the intensity of a gaze that penetrated his very soul. The air shifted, heavy and electric, as if the presence itself had altered the atmosphere, pressing in on Jonathan from every angle. The dolls around him remained perfectly still, yet he could sense them vibrating with anticipation, their porcelain faces almost glowing in the dim light, each one a reflection of their master's will. The Dollmaker spoke, though his lips did not move. The words filled Jonathan's mind directly, bypassing sound altogether. "So, you have arrived at the threshold, Jonathan. You feel fear. Good. That is necessary. Without fear, perfection cannot be harvested. Without terror, life cannot be captured." The voice was smooth, timeless, a silky coldness that pressed against Jonathan's consciousness. He felt his mind reel under the weight of centuries, the breadth of the Dollmaker's experience, and the sheer inevitability of his hunger. Jonathan's hands shook as he gripped the crowbar still clutched from his earlier desperate attack. I won't. I won't let you take me," he stammered, voice trembling, though he knew words were useless against such an entity. The Dollmaker's presence seemed to expand, or ripple across the room, pressing Jonathan to his knees. The dolls around him stirred, shifting imperceptibly, as if synchronized with their master's thoughts. He could feel the pull on his essence strengthen, tugging at his very identity, each heartbeat transferring a small piece of him into the waiting vessels around him. "Ah," the Dollmaker's thought voice murmured, almost amused, "you struggle." "Yes. That is the essence I crave, the defiance, the desperation, the fleeting hope. It flavors the process. It makes perfection exquisite." Jonathan's mind spun. He understood now, with gut-churning clarity, why the dolls were patient, why the process had taken decades, perhaps centuries. Each victim contributed to the refinement of the craft, each ounce of fear distilled into the porcelain, until the vessels were perfect in their mimicry, perfect in their containment, perfect extensions of the Dollmaker's immortality. The auburn-haired doll stepped forward, moving with the grace of someone, or something, perfectly in sync with its master. Its glassy eyes met Jonathan's, and for the first time, he could see the faint shimmer of life within, the faint echo of Mary Ellis's terror lingering behind the flawless features. He realized that the Dollmaker's power was not limited to a single vessel, it radiated outward, touching every doll in the room, every creation connected to him like neurons in a vast, unholy brain. Jonathan was caught in the center, a living conductor channeling the fear that fueled the collector's eternal work. Summoning his courage, Jonathan lunged at the largest doll again, this time aiming not to destroy, but to disrupt, to force a reaction. The doll swiveled impossibly fast, grabbing his wrist with porcelain fingers that were both delicate and unyielding. The moment their contact was made, a shockwave pulsed through him, a tidal wave of sensations, memories of others, flashes of terror, glimpses of countless stolen lives, swirling together in a nauseating storm. He collapsed to the floor, gasping, his mind reeling from the psychic assault. The Dollmaker's laughter, echoing, ancient, omnipresent, filled his consciousness, and Jonathan realized the horrifying truth: resistance was not merely futile, it fed the collector, made the process stronger, more refined, more inescapable. Jonathan struggled to focus, to remember some fragment of rational thought. He had read about the process, observed its signs, and now he was living it. Each movement, each flicker of fear, each desperate thought contributed to the perfection of the dolls. He understood with a sickening clarity that the collector did not merely observe, he orchestrated, guided, curated, and harvested. He was the conductor of an eternal symphony of terror. And yet, even as despair threatened to consume him, Jonathan noticed something subtle. The doll's movements, though fluid and precise, were coordinated, almost choreographed. There was a rhythm, a sequence, a pattern. If he could decipher it, perhaps he could disrupt it long enough to break free. He forced himself to rise, trembling, and took a tentative step backward, mind racing to map the positions and reactions of every figure in the cellar. The Dollmaker's voice echoed again, closer this time, a thought pressing into his mind like a vice. Time is irrelevant, Jonathan. Every heartbeat, every breath, every ounce of fear feeds the perfection. You are already part of the gallery. You are already mine. Jonathan felt the pull stronger than ever, tugging at his identity, threatening to splinter him into the same frozen, perfect form as the auburn-haired doll. But in that moment, a flicker of defiance ignited. He could feel the mechanism of the method, the lattice of power and attention that connected the dolls to their master. If he could disrupt it, even briefly, he might survive. As he steadied himself, calculating, planning, the auburn-haired doll extended her hand fully, porcelain fingertips brushing the edge of his cheek. The contact sent a shiver down his spine, a wave of stolen lives, of terror, of perfect mimicry, threatening to overwhelm him entirely. Jonathan closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of courage. He had seconds, perhaps less, to act, to break the flow of power, to resist the inevitability of transformation. And then, in the faintest whisper, he heard it, not from the Dollmaker, not from the dolls, but from somewhere deep inside himself: "You are not yet finished." Jonathan's muscles coiled with a desperate energy he had never known before. The Dollmaker's presence pressed on him like the weight of centuries, but within that suffocating terror burned a flicker of defiance. He lunged toward the center of the cellar, targeting the intricate lattice etched into the floorboards, the subtle grooves that pulsed faintly with the life energy the dolls fed upon. Each step toward the pattern was a battle against the psychic pull of the collector, against the whispers that clawed at his mind, promising submission, perfection, and eternity in porcelain. The auburn-haired doll's eyes flared, and the other figures shifted as one, a synchronized, predatory wave moving to intercept him. Jonathan slammed his crowbar into the floor with every ounce of force he could muster. The lattice splintered, grooves cracking under the blow, and for a fleeting moment, the psychic pull wavered. He could feel the tug on his essence ease slightly, the whispers faltering, the synchronized steps of the dolls breaking as though caught off guard. The auburn-haired doll stumbled, an imperceptible fracture in her perfect posture, and the others hesitated, their eyes flickering with confusion. It was a small victory, but enough. Jonathan realized that the lattice was not just decorative, it was the conduit, the method by which the Dollmaker amplified his reach, and if he could destroy it, he might disrupt the flow long enough to escape or even fight back. The Dollmaker's voice filled the room, calm, omnipresent, dripping with an icy amusement that made Jonathan's blood run cold. "Clever, but temporary. The lattice is only a part. You cannot undo centuries of collection, only delay the inevitable. Every second you resist adds flavor, yes, flavor, to the perfection." Jonathan's stomach churned at the thought, but he forced himself to focus, to channel his fear into action rather than submission. The dolls were extensions of the collector's will, yes, but if their movements were synchronized, then breaking the pattern, even briefly, could give him leverage. He had to act fast. He ran toward the far wall, grabbing the largest crate he could move. The dolls reacted instantaneously, shifting in perfect, uncanny unison to block him. The auburn-haired figure raised her hand, delicate porcelain fingers outstretched, and Jonathan felt the pull of her will, a cold tug against his very essence, attempting to drag him into the vessel that awaited him. He gritted his teeth and swung the crate, sending it crashing against a shelf. Dolls toppled, porcelain clattering against wood and stone, and the psychic hold faltered, just enough for Jonathan to slip past them toward the spiral staircase that led to the attic. The dolls recoiled for a fraction of a second, giving him a glimpse of hope, but then they surged forward again, faster, more coordinated, as though learning from his movements. Jonathan's mind raced. He had to keep moving, keep disrupting, keep forcing their attention away from him just enough to prevent the final transference. He remembered the diary once more, the meticulous entries of the original collector. The dolls were patient, yes, but they depended on fear, on hesitation, on the victim's moments of doubt. Jonathan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed, his fear sharpened into a weapon, a tool to manipulate the dolls' hunger against themselves. He reached the spiral staircase and scrambled upward, pulling himself breathlessly into the attic. The candlelight flickered over the room, revealing the dolls that had been quietly waiting, positioned with military precision. Some he recognized, the auburn-haired figure; others were new arrivals, grotesque caricatures of the missing, each frozen in a twisted mimicry of life. Jonathan could feel the collector's gaze even here, his influence stretching through walls, shadows, the very air, but the lattice had been disrupted, and with it, a fragile window had opened. Jonathan took a shaky breath and prepared to strike again. He grabbed a nearby beam, swinging it at the nearest doll. Porcelain shattered, glass eyes cracking under the force. The other dolls froze, and for a heartbeat, the attic fell into an eerie silence. But the pause was brief. A faint, melodic giggle echoed from the far corner, followed by a voice in his mind, cold and amused. "You amuse me, Jonathan. But amusement is not freedom. You cannot undo what has been perfected." The psychic pull returned, stronger this time, tugging at his mind, forcing visions of countless trapped souls into his consciousness. Jonathan staggered, head spinning, but he clenched his teeth, grounding himself. He had glimpsed the method, the lattice, the synchronization, the psychic siphon, and he understood that disruption was possible, but only temporarily. Every attack, every act of defiance, bought him a moment, a chance to understand more, to survive longer. The collector was patient, Jonathan had to be relentless. And then, from the shadows at the far end of the attic, the tallest, most imposing figure emerged. He was impossibly human in size yet radiated a presence that made the air itself seem to solidify. Jonathan's heart skipped, fear lancing through his veins. The Dollmaker had arrived, not a mere extension, not a proxy, but the immortal, meticulous collector himself. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but the faint glint of eyes beneath brim and shadow radiated intelligence, hunger, and centuries of perfected cruelty. Jonathan froze, every instinct screaming, as the Dollmaker stepped fully into view. The man's coat was impossibly black, swallowing the flickering candlelight, and the brim of his hat cast a shadow so deep it seemed to erase the features beneath it entirely. Yet Jonathan felt the weight of centuries in the way the collector moved, the slow, deliberate precision of a predator who had studied every nuance of fear, every flicker of hesitation, every instinctive twitch of prey for decades. Behind him, the dolls stood motionless, their eyes locked on their master, a silent army awaiting command. Jonathan realized, with a creeping terror, that they were extensions of this man, connected to his will in ways that defied reality, feeding on his presence as much as the fear of their victims. The collector's voice, when it came, was not spoken aloud. It filled Jonathan's mind directly, a silky tendril of thought that bypassed sound entirely. "Ah, you have spirit. Courage, defiance, such exquisite qualities. They are rare, so rare. Most break before I touch them. Most beg for the perfection they cannot comprehend." Jonathan staggered backward, heart hammering, struggling to ground himself. The psychic weight of the collector's presence pressed against his consciousness like a vice, sapping his strength, bending his will. The dolls around him shifted subtly, leaning forward, their eyes glinting, yet the true horror lay in the realization that the collector's attention amplified their power exponentially. He remembered the fragments from the diary, the tales of vanished children, the tales of lives slowly consumed over decades. The collector had not merely created dolls, he had perfected immortality through obsession, trapping essence in porcelain vessels that acted both as prisons and extensions of his consciousness. Each victim, each act of terror, each ounce of fear contributed to a symphony that had taken centuries to perfect. Jonathan's stomach churned as he realized he was not witnessing a man, but a method made manifest, meticulous, patient, and infinitely cruel. The auburn-haired doll stepped closer, moving as though guided by an unseen hand, and Jonathan felt the tug on his mind intensify. He could feel the collector's focus narrowing on him, each thought, each pulse of fear channeling into the lattice of the doll's attention, every doll vibrating with hunger as though waiting for the final act. He understood, with a sickening clarity, that the collector's obsession was not merely to capture life, it was to perfect it, to curate it, to turn terror into art. And he, Jonathan, was now part of that art, a centerpiece in a gallery centuries in the making. Desperation surged. Jonathan lunged at the nearest crate, shoving it toward the dolls to disrupt their formation. Porcelain shattered, glass eyes cracked, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of hope. The collector's thought voice cut through the momentary chaos, cold and amused. "Ah, disruption. Temporary. But your fear, exquisite. It makes the process more refined." Jonathan's mind reeled. He realized the collector derived sustenance not only from the essence of life but from the resistance, the terror, the struggle itself. Each act of defiance added flavor, heightened the perfection, and yet, each act also bought him precious seconds to survive. He backed toward a stack of old crates, scanning for any leverage, any weak point. His eyes fell on the lattice again, the etched grooves that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly energy. The collector's eyes, though shadowed, seemed to track him through the lattice, measuring, calculating. Jonathan knew he had to strike again, disrupt the flow, weaken the psychic pull. But each second he hesitated, he could feel the tug on his mind, the slow siphoning of his essence into the dolls, the inevitability of transformation closing in like the tightening coils of a predator's grip. The collector took a step closer, and the room seemed to contract, the walls pressing inward. "You have spirit, yes, but spirit is not enough. I have perfected fear, perfected desire, perfected life itself. You are my next masterpiece." Jonathan's knees buckled as the words penetrated his consciousness, revealing the horrific scale of obsession. The collector had been patient for centuries, waiting for the right moment, the right defiance, the right prey. And now, Jonathan was trapped, every heartbeat, every gasp, feeding the eternal perfection of the collector's work. Jonathan forced himself to stand, shaking, terrified, but alive in mind and body. He had to understand, had to find a flaw, a pattern, some weakness in centuries of meticulous planning. If he could disrupt the method, even temporarily, he might survive, or at least delay the inevitable. The dolls leaned forward slightly, anticipation radiating from their porcelain forms, and Jonathan felt the collector's attention focus like a physical weight pressing on his chest. He had seconds, maybe less, to act, to fight, to defy. Then, from the far corner, he noticed something subtle, a doll that had been hidden, a figure slightly off balance, a tiny imperfection in the pattern. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Perhaps centuries of obsession could not account for every variable, every irregularity, every human unpredictability. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could turn the perfection against itself. He took a deep breath, focusing every ounce of remaining strength, every shred of defiance, and prepared to strike again. Jonathan's hand froze inches from the hidden doll, the tiny imperfection almost imperceptible in the dim attic light. His pulse throbbed violently in his temples, every fiber of his being screaming in terror, yet he forced himself to focus. The collector's presence pressed down like a physical weight, cold and unyielding, threading through his mind with the inevitability of centuries of perfected obsession. The auburn-haired doll inched closer, porcelain fingers outstretched, and the other figures shifted in precise, predatory synchronization. The whispers, a chorus of stolen souls, grew louder, wrapping around his thoughts, threatening to crush his sanity. Jonathan clenched his teeth and lunged at the hidden doll, shoving it violently to the floor. Porcelain shattered with a sharp, echoing crash, the fragments scattering across the boards like shards of frozen screams. For the briefest moment, the lattice of power that connected the dolls faltered. The auburn-haired doll stumbled, the perfectly coordinated movement of the others breaking as if the rhythm of centuries had been interrupted. Jonathan's heart leapt, this was the chance he had been seeking. The collector's thought voice surged in response, colder and sharper than before, bold, audacious, but futile. You cannot disrupt perfection. You may amuse me, but you cannot escape. Jonathan staggered backward, scanning the attic for a weapon, anything to exploit the fleeting chaos. Candlelight flickered across crates and old trunks, illuminating faces frozen in terror, faces of the stolen, encapsulated in porcelain, each one a testament to the collector's centuries-long obsession. The room seemed to pulse with the stolen life within them, a rhythm that Jonathan now understood. The collector's consciousness radiated through the dolls like a living organism, a predator in multiple forms. Every broken doll, every disruption, momentarily weakened the flow, but only briefly. The collector was patient, he had the luxury of centuries. He spotted a pile of heavier crates and, with a surge of adrenaline, began pushing them into a barricade, hoping to slow the advancing dolls and create space for maneuvering. The auburn-haired figure moved with unnerving precision, sidestepping each obstacle, her glassy eyes tracking him like a predator sizing up a prey animal. Jonathan realized that she was not merely following orders, she was anticipating him, reading his movements, part of a hive mind directed by the collector's will. Each doll's attention amplified the psychic pull, and Jonathan could feel the tug on his essence intensifying with every step. Resistance was feeding them, but without resistance, there might be no chance at all. In a moment of grim clarity, Jonathan understood the method fully. The dolls and the collector operated on a combination of physical, psychological, and supernatural control. They harvested fear, mind essence, and used the attention of the victim to accelerate the process of transformation. Each second of panic, each struggle, each instinctive act of defiance fed the dolls and strengthened the collector's power. To survive, Jonathan needed not only to disrupt the lattice but to turn his fear into strategy, to manipulate the process rather than simply resist it. The collector's presence loomed larger, and Jonathan felt his mind bending under the pressure. Ah, defiance. Delicious. I have waited centuries for prey with spirit such as yours. You will be exquisite, a masterpiece unlike any before. The words wrapped around his thoughts like chains. Jonathan's hands shook as he gripped the crowbar again, aware that his physical efforts were only part of the battle. The true struggle was mental, a contest of will against a being who had perfected manipulation of both mind and body over generations. He forced himself to breathe, forcing his mind to calm. He had learned one critical thing: the collector and his dolls were methodical, almost ritualistic. If he could force them to overextend, to break the rhythm even slightly, he might create a window of escape or counterattack. Jonathan's eyes scanned the room, noting subtle misalignments, the flicker of hesitation in a doll's movement, a slight delay in their synchronization. Every flaw, no matter how tiny, was a potential leverage point. Jonathan lunged again, this time swinging the crowbar at the tallest doll's legs. Porcelain cracked, glass eyes shattered, and the synchronized rhythm faltered more than before. The auburn-haired figure shrieked, a sound somewhere between porcelain cracking and human despair, and Jonathan felt the pull on his mind weaken for a moment, a fleeting reprieve. He pushed forward, forcing himself to stay in motion, using each broken doll, each shattered fragment of porcelain, to delay the inevitable transference. But the collector was patient, infinitely so. Jonathan felt the surge of centuries-old power coalesce in the room, an overwhelming presence pressing in from every corner. The collector's thought voice, calm yet terrifyingly intense, filled his mind, every movement, every act of defiance, it is all mine to shape. You amuse me, Jonathan. Let us see how long your spirit can endure before perfection claims you. Jonathan's vision blurred, sweat and fear mingling as the attic seemed to pulse with the rhythm of countless trapped souls. He realized that this was only the beginning, the collector had not yet revealed his full method, had not yet begun the true transference. This confrontation was a test, a probe, a prelude to the horror that awaited him if he failed to find a weakness. He clenched his jaw, forcing every ounce of will into his next action, knowing that survival meant not only strength and speed, but understanding, the key to enduring the collector's centuries of perfected terror. The attic fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by Jonathan's ragged breaths and the faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. The dolls stood in a precise half-circle now, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle, their painted lips frozen in faint, knowing smiles. Jonathan realized, with a sick chill, that he had been herded into the center of the room, like prey cornered in a trap. The collector's shadow loomed larger, as though it no longer belonged to the proportions of a man but to something vast, endless, a figure stretching across time itself. Then it began. The humming grew louder, resonating through the dolls, through the shattered porcelain pieces scattered across the floor, and finally, through Jonathan's very bones. He staggered as the air thickened, each breath harder to pull into his lungs. His vision shimmered, and for an instant, he thought he saw two realities overlapping, the attic, with its crates and shadows, and another place, colder, filled with endless shelves lined with dolls, stretching far beyond sight, each shelf a mausoleum of stolen faces. The collector's voice pressed into his mind with a sharp intensity. It begins, Jonathan. The transference. Every soul sings when it is freed, and yours will be a symphony. Jonathan's body convulsed as a searing cold spread from his chest outward, as though invisible threads were being tugged loose from within him. He screamed, the sound raw and desperate, but his voice was swallowed by the humming chorus. The auburn-haired doll stepped closer, her glass eyes glowing faintly now, and Jonathan understood with horrifying clarity, she was the vessel, the porcelain body that would house his essence once it was torn free. Her hand rose slowly, palm open, as if beckoning him forward, though he felt no control over the way his body shuddered, pulled against his will. He fought, clenching his fists, trying to anchor himself to the here and now. He thought of his apartment, the smell of old books in his study, the scratch of his cat's claws against the couch, the taste of strong coffee in the morning. He hurled these memories like anchors into the swirling void, desperate to tether himself. For a moment, the humming faltered, as though the dolls themselves recoiled from the vividness of his defiance. But then the collector's voice returned, deeper and colder than before. Yes. Cling. Struggle. It makes the flavor richer. Do not think of escape, Jonathan. Think only of how much more exquisite your fear makes you. The lattice on the floor flared faintly, glowing with a sickly, phosphorescent light. Symbols etched into the wood centuries ago pulsed, alive with a power that did not belong to this world. Jonathan's legs buckled beneath him as he was dragged mentally toward the circle's center. His skin prickled, the sensation of countless invisible fingers brushing against him, tugging, peeling away the thin boundary between his flesh and the essence beneath. His breath came in ragged gasps, sweat pouring down his face, his heart hammering so violently it felt ready to explode. And then, he saw them. Faces. Dozens, hundreds, thousands, ghostly visages crowding the edges of his vision. They were the souls of the trapped, staring with hollow eyes from the porcelain prisons where they had been forced to linger. Some were twisted in silent screams, others frozen in terror, and a few bore expressions of eerie serenity, as if the collector had broken them so thoroughly they had become willing exhibits in his eternal gallery. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering words he could not fully grasp, though the intent was clear: warning, despair, resignation. Jonathan's knees hit the floor, the force of the pull overwhelming him. The auburn-haired doll loomed closer now, bending slightly, her painted face inches from his. For a flickering second, her expression shifted, so subtle it could have been his imagination. Behind the glass eyes, he thought he saw a flash of humanity, a flicker of pain, as if the soul within had not been fully erased. It gave him a spark of hope. If the soul still lingered inside the dolls, then maybe the collector's perfection was not complete. Maybe there was a flaw in the method, a weakness he could exploit. But the collector felt his realization. The voice lashed at him like a whip: do not mistake survival for victory. They remain only because I will it so. Their terror sustains me. Their existence feeds my artistry. Soon, you will join them, not as a flaw, but as the pinnacle of my creation. The attic shook as the lattice flared brighter, and Jonathan felt the first strands of his essence tearing free, drawn toward the auburn-haired doll's waiting vessel. The sensation was agony beyond comprehension, like being burned alive and frozen solid at once, like every nerve was being peeled away from his body. He screamed again, his voice raw and animalistic. Yet even through the pain, Jonathan clung to the image of that flicker in the doll's eyes. A flaw. A resistance. Something the collector had overlooked or underestimated. And in that single crack, Jonathan found something to cling to, a chance, however small, to fight back against a being that had perfected horror for centuries. His fists clenched tighter, his nails cutting into his palms until blood dripped onto the glowing floorboards, mingling with the lattice's symbols. The collector's presence recoiled, just slightly, as if Jonathan's raw, physical will was something unpredictable, something outside the boundaries of his perfect ritual. Jonathan realized then that the collector thrived on inevitability, on the certainty of his process. Defiance alone was not enough. He had to inject chaos, something that perfection could not anticipate, something that would shatter the rhythm of centuries. His body shook violently as the pull intensified, dragging him closer to the breaking point. The auburn-haired doll reached out again, her glassy fingers brushing the air near his face. He stared back into those eyes, daring her, or the soul within her, to resist alongside him. Jonathan's scream died in his throat as he watched the impossible, a tear, glistening inhuman, rolling down the smooth, painted cheek of the auburn-haired doll. It was subtle, fragile, yet more shattering than any crack of porcelain. For a moment, everything around him seemed to still. The hum softened, the lattice's glow dimmed just slightly, and the collector's voice faltered, no longer the seamless stream of cold superiority but laced with something sharp, something like irritation. "No, not you. Not now." Jonathan's lungs burned as he dragged in a ragged breath, his body trembling under the strain of the half-completed transference. The invisible threads tugging at his soul still pulled relentlessly, but now there was resistance, another force tugging back. He stared into the doll's glass eyes, and for the first time, they didn't feel like windows of emptiness. They felt alive. There was a soul in there, pushing against the collector's control, straining to reach him. A faint whisper threaded into Jonathan's mind, not like the collector's invasive roar, but soft, weak, almost drowned out by the psychic storm. "Help me." The revelation hit Jonathan like a jolt of lightning. The dolls were not merely vessels, they were prisons. The souls trapped inside were not erased, but shackled, smothered, kept alive as fuel for the collector's endless artistry. That meant the perfection was a lie. The process was not absolute. The obsession had cracks the collector had hidden but could not seal completely. The auburn-haired doll's terror was proof that will, even after centuries of torment, could still resist. If one soul could fight back, perhaps others could too. But the collector was already moving to crush the rebellion. His shadow swelled across the attic walls, consuming the candlelight, pressing down with suffocating force. The dolls in the half-circle tightened their stance, their heads snapping in unison toward Jonathan and the auburn-haired figure. The hum rose again, louder, more violent this time, as if the very boards of the attic vibrated with fury. Jonathan felt the psychic weight double, the collector's voice thundering in his skull. "Do not be deceived by weakness. They are mine. Their tears, their whispers, their struggles, every ounce of them belongs to me. And soon, so will you." Jonathan gritted his teeth, his bloodied palms pressing harder into the floor as he fought the pull. His vision blurred with pain, but that single tear burned in his mind like a beacon. He wasn't alone in this fight, not entirely. If he could disrupt the lattice again, weaken the collector's grip, maybe he could give that flickering soul inside the doll more strength to resist. He searched the glowing symbols beneath him, noticing how his blood had smeared across one of the etched lines, dulling its glow. The realization struck him with clarity: the lattice was not invincible. It demanded symmetry, perfection. His blood had tainted it, disrupted its flawless geometry. That was why the collector had recoiled. Fueled by desperation, Jonathan slammed his bleeding hand across another etched symbol, smearing it deliberately. The lattice flickered violently, the hum stuttering like a broken machine. The dolls staggered, some twitching unnaturally as if their strings had been pulled too sharply. The auburn-haired doll jerked back, and for a split second, Jonathan saw her expression change, glass eyes widening, lips quivering, as though the soul inside had surfaced through the porcelain mask. The collector roared in fury, his thought voice no longer smooth but fractured, jagged with rage. "Enough. You cannot break what I have perfected. You cannot undo centuries of craft with blood and defiance." The room shook, dust cascading from the rafters, the floor groaning under the force of his wrath. Yet Jonathan saw the truth hidden in that anger: the collector could be shaken. Perfection was not unbreakable, it was fragile when faced with the unpredictable, with chaos. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jonathan dragged himself upright, swaying on unsteady legs, the crowbar still gripped in one trembling hand. He faced the dolls, the collector, the pulsing lattice beneath him, and forced his voice to rise above the humming chorus: "You're not perfect. You're afraid. If you weren't, you wouldn't need them to cry for you. You wouldn't need me to resist. His words were shaky, but they struck like daggers, for the shadows around the collector flinched, and the dolls trembled as though the truth had resonated through their hollow bodies. The auburn-haired doll's terror had not been an accident, it had been a message. Jonathan could feel it now, faint and flickering, but undeniably there. The trapped soul inside was pushing back, lending him strength. He reached toward her, ignoring the agony tearing through his body as the collector tried to drag him down. "Fight with me," he whispered hoarsely. "You're not gone. You're not his. Not yet." For a heartbeat, everything seemed to hang in silence. Then the doll's lips, still frozen in porcelain, moved, just barely, but enough for Jonathan to see. A single word escaped in the faintest of whispers, carried not through sound but straight into his mind: yes. The sound ripped through the attic like a thunderclap, raw, guttural, and utterly alien. Jonathan had not believed the collector capable of pain, let alone something as human as a scream. Yet there it was, echoing in his skull and rattling the floorboards, a sound that seemed to peel the shadows off the walls. The dolls jerked violently, their porcelain limbs twitching in spasms that cracked their delicate joints. Some toppled, hitting the floor in graceless heaps, their carefully constructed facades suddenly clumsy and imperfect. Jonathan staggered, shielding his eyes from the blinding surge of energy that erupted from the fractured lattice beneath him, a storm of light and shadow colliding in chaotic bursts. When he dared to look again, the attic was changed. The lattice glowed unevenly now, its once perfect symmetry ruined by the blood smeared across its lines, fissures spreading like veins of fire through the wood. The dolls no longer stood in perfect unison, they shifted erratically, some clutching their own faces, others collapsing as if strings had been cut. And the auburn-haired doll, she no longer looked like a hollow puppet. Her eyes blazed faintly, her porcelain chest rising and falling as though some fragment of humanity had been restored. Jonathan felt her presence in his mind, faint but urgent, pushing back against the collector's hold. The collector's shadow convulsed, stretching grotesquely across the rafters, a monstrous silhouette of elongated limbs and twisting shapes. His voice no longer carried the smooth confidence of a master craftsman but roared like a fractured storm. "Do not mistake a fracture for defeat. You meddle in artistry you cannot comprehend. You disrupt a design perfected over centuries. And yet, you dare." The words slammed into Jonathan's mind with such force he nearly blacked out, but the faltering rhythm betrayed the truth. The collector was shaken, his perfection compromised. Jonathan swayed, clutching the crowbar like a lifeline, every muscle trembling. His body ached from the half-completed transference, a hollow coldness still gnawing at his chest where the invisible threads had torn at his essence. But pain meant he was still here. Resistance meant he was still his own. He fixed his gaze on the auburn-haired doll, on the humanity that flickered within her, and forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse but defiant. "You're not flawless. You hide cracks beneath the paint. These people, they're still alive in there. You didn't erase them. You couldn't." The doll's glass eyes shimmered, and Jonathan felt her soul press harder against the collector's influence, a fragile but undeniable will. Around her, some of the other dolls twitched, their heads snapping unnaturally, as though fragments of their trapped souls were straining toward the same spark of defiance. A wave of whispers washed through Jonathan's mind, faint and fragmented, names, pleas, fragments of memories. It was overwhelming, a cacophony of lost humanity, but also a sign that the collector's perfection was unraveling. The collector's fury erupted, shaking the attic with such violence that beams groaned and dust rained down like ash. "Silence. They are mine. Their whispers, their tears, their very breath, mine. I gave them eternity. I shaped them into art beyond mortality. I alone decide what remains and what breaks." His shadow lashed out, a dark tendril whipping across the attic floor, knocking crates aside with brutal force. Jonathan barely dove aside, the crowbar clattering from his hand as splinters flew into the air. His shoulder slammed into the wall, pain jolting down his arm, but he refused to give in. The auburn-haired doll took a halting step forward, her movements no longer dictated entirely by the collector. Her arm trembled as if she were fighting herself, but Jonathan saw it: resistance. Humanity clawing its way back through porcelain. She turned her head toward him, and he heard the whisper again, stronger this time, desperate: "Break the lattice." Jonathan's gaze snapped to the glowing floor. The cracks he had smeared with his blood were spreading, but not enough. The lattice was still active, still feeding the collector power, still tethering the dolls to his will. If he could destroy it completely, maybe he could sever the connection, weaken the collector long enough to free the trapped souls. His eyes darted to the crowbar lying just a few feet away, half buried under broken wood. His chest heaved, the coldness inside him pulsing with every heartbeat. He didn't know if he had the strength left, but he knew this was his chance. The collector sensed his intent instantly. Shadows writhed like serpents, coiling across the floor, cutting off his path to the crowbar. "You will not touch it. You will not undo my life's work." The voice was venom now, desperate to conceal fear. Jonathan crawled toward the weapon anyway, dragging his battered body across the floorboards, ignoring the pain, ignoring the weight pressing on his chest. Each inch forward felt like wading through tar, every breath a battle, but the whispers of the trapped souls urged him on. They surged around him, filling his head with a collective plea: "Break it! Break it! Break it!" His fingers closed around the crowbar just as a shadowy tendril lashed across his back, searing pain exploding down his spine. He cried out, his vision flashing white, but his grip tightened. Summoning every last shred of defiance, Jonathan raised the crowbar high, his arm trembling with exhaustion, and brought it crashing down onto the glowing lattice with a roar. The attic erupted. Light burst from the shattered symbols, searing through shadow, filling the room with blinding radiance. The dolls screamed, not mechanical, not hollow, but human screams, raw and tormented, bursting free from porcelain throats. The auburn-haired doll collapsed to her knees, her glass eyes flooding with tears, as though centuries of silence had finally broken. The collector's scream returned, louder than before, a sound that shook Jonathan's soul and made his teeth ache. Shadows writhed violently, pulling back, recoiling from the light as though burned. Jonathan fell forward, gasping, the crowbar slipping from his hand. His body shook uncontrollably, but he forced his head up to see. The lattice was cracked wide open, its glow sputtering, symbols fractured beyond repair. The collector's form wavered, his shadow unraveling, stretching thinner, less defined. Yet even in his weakened state, the presence lingered, coiling with venomous intent. "You think this is victory? You have freed nothing. They are bound to me. Even in chaos, perfection endures." Jonathan's chest heaved as he looked toward the auburn-haired doll. She raised her head slowly, her porcelain face streaked with cracks, her lips moving again. This time, her whisper was not one of despair, but of warning. "Not broken, yet." The floor gave way in an explosion of splintering wood and choking dust. Jonathan had only a heartbeat to gasp before he plummeted into darkness, the broken boards clawing at his arms as if the house itself wanted to drag him down. He crashed onto a hard surface below, pain detonating across his ribs and shoulder, the air torn from his lungs. For several agonizing seconds he lay there, dazed, the muffled roar of the collector echoing above him like a storm trapped in the rafters. When he finally forced his eyes open, the first thing he noticed was the smell, thick, cloying, a mixture of damp earth and something metallic, coppery, unmistakably blood. As his vision adjusted, Jonathan realized he had fallen into a hidden chamber beneath the attic, a place carved into the very bones of the house. The air was heavy with centuries of neglect, yet everything down here was disturbingly deliberate. Along the walls stretched shelves upon shelves of dolls, far more than he had seen above, their porcelain faces illuminated by faint, unnatural glows etched into the stone floor. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, lined in perfect rows, each one bearing a different expression: fear, sorrow, rage, despair. Their glass eyes glinted in the dimness, all fixed on him, and Jonathan felt as though he had stumbled into a crypt, a mausoleum of stolen humanity. But this was no simple storage. At the center of the chamber stood something far worse, a massive table of blackened wood, covered with tools that were not wholly of this world. Scalpels twisted into impossible angles, needles that shimmered with both steel and shadow, brushes stiff with dried crimson. On the table lay fragments of porcelain skulls, limbs in various stages of crafting, and, most horrifying of all, faces. Not painted porcelain, but real faces, human and pale, stretched thin and brittle, as though they had been peeled away and preserved. Jonathan staggered back, bile rising in his throat, the sight threatening to unmoor what little sanity he had left. The collector's presence followed him even here, seeping down through the broken boards above like a spreading stain. Shadows oozed along the chamber walls, whispering in voices that carried both command and torment. Behold the heart of my art, Jonathan. Every creation, every perfected vessel, born here. You thought you had broken me? No, you have only opened the door. You stand now in my gallery, in the place where eternity is crafted. Jonathan's legs trembled as he took a step backward, the weight of countless glassy eyes pinning him in place. The dolls here were different from the ones above. Their faces were not merely masks of paint, they twitched. Tiny spasms rippled across their features, as though the souls within were still fighting, straining against porcelain prisons. A low, collective murmur filled the chamber, not words this time but a sound like the restless stirring of 1,000 condemned voices. It reverberated through Jonathan's chest, filling him with both terror and a strange sense of urgency. He realized, with a lurch, that this was the true core of the curse. The attic had been a stage, a place for performance, but this chamber was the workshop, the crucible where the collector's immortality had been forged and refined. Every doll above had been born here, every soul ripped from flesh and sealed in porcelain beneath the weight of these symbols and tools. And if the lattice upstairs had been the collector's instrument of control, then this was the engine that powered it all. Jonathan's hand brushed against the crowbar he had miraculously retained in the fall. His grip tightened. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but he forced himself to stay standing. He could feel the presence of the auburn-haired soul faintly within him, her whisper lingering at the edges of his thoughts. Not broken, yet. The dolls around him stirred as if in agreement, their glass eyes flickering with faint glows, some mouths twitching in silent cries. The sight both horrified and emboldened him. If they could still resist, even faintly, then maybe the collector's perfection wasn't eternal. But the collector was not about to give him time. From the far wall, the shadows began to coalesce, folding inward, shaping themselves into a form that was at once man and monstrosity. The brimmed hat remained, but beneath it the features twisted, shifting like molten wax, eyes that were voids one moment and burning coals the next, a mouth that stretched too wide for a human face. His body elongated unnaturally, arms bending in ways bones were never meant to bend, as though the centuries of stolen essences had warped his own form beyond recognition. You have seen my workshop, Jonathan. You know now the futility of resistance. Do you think you can undo this? This cathedral of perfection, built from centuries of devotion? You are but one man. They are mine. And soon, you will be too. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps, yet his grip on the crowbar tightened until his knuckles burned. He scanned the chamber, searching for weakness, for imperfection, for anything he could use. His eyes caught the glowing etchings on the stone floor, symbols similar to the lattice above, but larger, older, carved deep into the rock itself. If this was the collector's true engine, then breaking these might unravel everything. But they weren't delicate wood carvings he could smear with blood, these were carved into stone, pulsing with a power that felt alive. The murmur of the dolls swelled, louder now, as though they sensed his thoughts, urging him toward action. Their glassy eyes flickered brighter, and Jonathan felt dozens of faint presences pressing against his mind, not hostile this time but pleading, desperate. They wanted freedom. They wanted release. And somewhere among them, the auburn-haired soul whispered again, stronger now, strike the heart. The collector's monstrous form advanced, the shadows stretching across the floor like talons. Jonathan staggered backward, his eyes locked on the glowing etchings, his mind racing. Strike the heart. Was it the center of the symbols? The blackened table with its obscene tools? Or something even deeper, something hidden among the shelves of dolls that lined the chamber? His pulse thundered as the walls seemed to close in, every second bringing the collector closer, every breath pulling him deeper into the suffocating weight of the curse. And then Jonathan saw it. Behind the monstrous figure, at the far end of the chamber, stood a single shelf apart from the others. Upon it rested one doll larger than the rest, its porcelain smoother, its face eerily blank. Unlike the others, its glass eyes did not flicker, they burned with steady light. The murmurs from the surrounding dolls grew frenzied, desperate, and Jonathan understood. That doll was not a vessel. It was the anchor. The heart of the curse. Jonathan lunged forward, his body a storm of pain and adrenaline, the crowbar gripped in both trembling hands. Every step toward the far shelf felt like running through wet cement, the collector's shadows dragging at his limbs, clawing at his ankles as if the house itself had turned against him. His chest burned with each ragged breath, and yet the sight of the anchor doll at the end of the chamber filled him with a savage determination. Its eyes glowed not like the restless flickers of the other dolls, but with a steady, malignant brilliance, as though something deeper than all the others lived within, something older, something that had been waiting centuries to be discovered. The collector's laughter rippled through the chamber, not merely sound but vibration, a low frequency that set Jonathan's teeth on edge and rattled his very bones. The brimmed hat shadowed a face that never stopped changing, one moment a hollow-eyed corpse, the next a young craftsman with pristine features, then a blurred hybrid of both. His voice oozed across the chamber like oil on water. "Ah, you found it. My heart, my masterpiece. But tell me, Jonathan, what artist allows his work to be destroyed? No, you will not touch it. You will join it." As the words echoed, the walls erupted with movement. The dolls lining the shelves began to tremble violently, their tiny porcelain hands drumming against the wood in a rhythmic pattern, as though applauding or chanting for the collector's victory. Some of their faces cracked open, splitting at the lips, and from within issued muffled screams, horrors so raw they threatened to tear Jonathan's sanity apart. He clamped his teeth together, refusing to let the noise swallow him. The anchor doll's gaze seared into him as he staggered closer. Its burning eyes were not passive, they were aware. He could feel its attention drilling into his mind, probing, searching for weaknesses. Whispers began bleeding into his thoughts, half memories, half nightmares. His mother's disappointed voice, his father's hollow silence, his sister's cry of despair the day she vanished years ago, her face now eerily mirrored in one of the dolls that twitched and reached for him. Jonathan faltered, the crowbar slipping in his grip, a wave of dizziness threatening to crush him. The anchor doll was fighting back, its power burrowing directly into his soul. But then came another voice, softer yet stronger than the rest, the auburn-haired soul, the one who had been with him since the attic. Her words were not whispers of despair but a lifeline, weaving clarity through the madness. "Do not look at it. Do not listen. Strike, Jonathan. Strike while you still breathe." Her presence was a candle in the storm, and Jonathan clung to it, his legs dragging him forward. The collector finally moved, his body unfolding like a grotesque marionette pulled by invisible strings. He surged forward with impossible speed, shadows lashing outward like whips. Jonathan dove to the side, the tendrils barely missing his chest, leaving behind streaks of ice where they grazed his arm. The pain was searing, as though the shadows had burned his very blood. He landed hard, ribs screaming in protest, but he forced himself up again, dragging his body toward the shelf where the anchor doll awaited. The murmurs of the other dolls reached a crescendo, a cacophony of human agony and porcelain rattling that filled the chamber like the roar of an ocean. Some dolls toppled from their shelves, shattering on the stone floor. But instead of releasing anything, their fragments crawled toward the collector, reforming like insects drawn to their hive. Jonathan realized with mounting horror that the dolls were not simply vessels, they were extensions of him, each one a vein connected to the same monstrous heart. And yet, amidst this storm of despair, the anchor doll remained perfectly still, glowing eyes fixed on Jonathan with cold inevitability. He raised the crowbar with every ounce of strength left in his battered body. His vision blurred, sweat and blood mingling, his lungs burning as if they were filled with smoke. He knew this was his only chance, either he struck now, or he would never rise again. The collector shrieked, a sound that shattered like glass and roared like thunder all at once. He lunged, arms elongating, shadow fingers reaching to crush Jonathan's skull before he could strike. The chamber seemed to bend inward, time slowing, the dolls screaming louder than ever. Jonathan's heart thundered in his ears as he summoned everything he had left, every ounce of rage, every fragment of grief, every scrap of hope, and drove the crowbar down toward the anchor doll. The iron tip struck porcelain with a sound like cracking ice. A fissure bloomed across the doll's blank face, spreading in jagged lines. Light burst from the cracks, blinding and searing, the glow so intense it burned his retinas even with eyes squeezed shut. The ground convulsed, the shelves shaking violently, dolls tumbling like rain, shattering upon impact. The murmurs turned into screams, thousands of voices wailing in unison, a chorus of torment and release that reverberated through Jonathan's bones. The collector howled, his form convulsing, shadows unraveling into smoke. His brimmed hat fell, revealing a face that no longer shifted. It was hollow, a mask of cracked porcelain hiding nothing beneath. He staggered, reaching for the anchor doll even as Jonathan's crowbar smashed down again, widening the fissure until the face caved inward with an ear-splitting shatter. And then came the silence. A silence so vast it pressed against Jonathan's ears, swallowing every sound until only the thunder of his heartbeat remained. The light from the anchor doll surged outward in a wave, washing over the chamber, filling every crack and corner. For one suspended moment, Jonathan felt the souls within the other dolls stir, their cries shifting from torment to something else, something like gratitude, like release. But then, beneath that radiant silence, a whisper slithered through, low and venomous, crawling into Jonathan's ear, "You've only broken the vessel, not me." The chamber groaned like a living thing in agony, its walls flexing inward and outward as though it breathed. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in choking waves, shelves rattled and toppled, and porcelain limbs scattered across the trembling floor. Jonathan staggered, blinking through the haze, his eyes seared from the blast of light that had erupted when the anchor doll shattered. He pressed one hand to his temple, trying to steady his spinning vision. For a brief, impossible moment, he thought he had done it, that the curse had ended. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight that had pressed against his lungs seemed to lift, and the whispers had quieted into a silence so vast it almost felt sacred. But silence is a dangerous thing in places like this. Jonathan soon realized it wasn't peace at all, it was the kind of silence that waits, that holds its breath before something worse arrives. The stillness hummed at the edges of perception, like the moment before a storm tears open the sky. And in that hush, he heard it, a single, deliberate sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing across the chamber floor. Not frantic, not weakened. Calm. Certain. Jonathan turned, and his stomach dropped. The collector still stood. His form was no longer the towering, monstrous shape of shadows, it had collapsed inward, reduced to a lean figure that looked disturbingly human. But that made him more terrifying, not less. His brimmed hat rested once more on his head, though now it seemed stitched from shadow itself. His porcelain mask face was cracked from forehead to chin, thin fissures leaking faint strands of light like glowing veins. But behind those cracks, something writhed, something alive, shifting, crawling beneath the surface as though his body were nothing more than a thin shell restraining the chaos within. His voice, when it came, was not the booming roar of before but something quieter, more intimate. "You misunderstand, Jonathan. The anchor was not me. It was only a cage, a vessel to hold the hunger still. And you, in your desperate flailing, have broken it wide open." He lifted one hand, and Jonathan recoiled, expecting an attack. But the collector merely spread his fingers, revealing that his palm was hollow, an opening from which threads of black smoke unraveled and slithered upward into the air. They writhed like worms, seeking, hungering. Jonathan's pulse thundered. He stumbled backward, his foot crunching porcelain fragments. "No, no, you're weakening. I saw it, I saw the doll shatter. I felt them released." His voice cracked, more plea than conviction. The collector tilted his head, the gesture eerily precise, like a puppet responding to unseen strings. "Released, yes. But release does not mean salvation. A soul torn free after centuries of captivity does not drift peacefully into light. It screams, it clings, it devours whatever it can reach. You have freed them, Jonathan. But where do you suppose they went? As if to answer, the chamber filled with sound again, not whispers this time but wails, a rising chorus of grief and rage. The dolls that remained intact shook violently, their eyes glowing with feverish intensity. Jonathan felt something press against him, not physically but inside his chest, as though 100 desperate hands clawed at his heart, his breath, his very being. He doubled over, choking, the crowbar slipping from his grip. Their voices weren't just sound, they were inside him, begging, cursing, demanding. Don't leave us. Free me. Take my pain. Let me in. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing. The cries were inside his skull. The auburn-haired soul's whisper rose above the others, steadier, more focused. Resist, Jonathan. Don't let them take root. They are lost, but you still live. The collector took a slow step forward, the crack in his mask spreading slightly with a dry snap. Light bled from it in tendrils, writhing like veins across his form. You see now? You are no hero. You are the crowbar in the hand of destiny, a tool that has cracked the jar but cannot contain what spills out. They will feed until they find a new anchor. Perhaps you, Jonathan. Perhaps the house. Perhaps something worse. Jonathan forced himself upright, sweat and blood running down his face. His body screamed with exhaustion, but fury gave him strength. Then I'll end it. All of it. I'll bring the whole cursed place down if I have to. His gaze darted to the chamber walls, the symbols still faintly glowing though weaker than before. The structure trembled like a failing heart. He thought of smashing them, tearing the place apart stone by stone. But the collector chuckled softly, a sound that made Jonathan's skin crawl. And if you succeed? If you shatter this place entirely? Do you think their souls will vanish? No, Jonathan. They will scatter like ash in the wind, free, unbound, wild. And you will have loosed 1,000 hungry dolls into the world without shells to contain them. Tell me, will you carry that sin? Jonathan faltered, the crowbar heavy in his hand, his mind caught between horror and indecision. The doll's cries surged louder, a flood of desperation battering against his thoughts. He could no longer tell if they begged for freedom or for consumption. His chest ached as though his very soul were being tugged apart. And through it all, the collector stood calm, steady, watching him with those cracked, glowing eyes. So choose, Jonathan. Strike again and loose them. Or falter, and I take you. Either way, the art lives on. Jonathan's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. His hand tightened on the crowbar. The walls shook harder. Dust rained down. He knew he had no more time to think. Jonathan's arms shook as he gripped the crowbar, the iron slick with sweat and blood. His pulse roared in his ears, each beat reminding him of the narrowing distance between life and oblivion. Before him, the collector stood unmoving, a cracked statue clothed in shadow, radiating an almost patient malice. Behind him, the shelves of dolls screamed and convulsed, their tiny porcelain faces twisting into masks of grief and hunger. The chamber trembled as though it waited for his decision, the very air taut with expectation, ready to shatter the moment he struck. He thought of the options laid before him, both poisoned, both steeped in ruin. If he brought the chamber down by destroying the glowing symbols, he would collapse the prison itself, scattering the tortured souls like embers carried on the wind. They would not be freed to peace, but loosed upon the world as restless predators, no longer confined to porcelain. 1,000 curses could spread into the night, devouring innocence, nesting in new hosts, continuing the collector's legacy in fragmented, chaotic form. The thought made bile rise in his throat. Could he live knowing he had unchained such a plague? But if he struck the collector directly, the risk might be worse. The cracked mask already leaked power, light spilling in tendrils that pulsed like arteries. The collector was no mere man, he was the culmination of centuries of stolen essence, every doll, every vessel a stitch in his eternal tapestry. To strike at him might not destroy him but instead open him fully, unleashing whatever storm churned beneath that fragile shell. Jonathan imagined himself torn apart in an instant, his body nothing more than a vessel for the collector to claim. The dolls' voices battered him relentlessly, drowning his thoughts in their clamor. Strike the walls, let us fly, break the chains, don't leave us here, kill him, save us, destroy everything. The conflicting demands swirled in his head like a cyclone, each syllable stabbing at his sanity. He staggered, nearly dropping the crowbar, his knees buckling under the unseen weight of their desperation. His eyes burned with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. And then, piercing through the cacophony, came the whisper of the auburn-haired soul, steady and sharp as a blade. Jonathan. Focus. He feeds on your hesitation. Do not listen to the others, they are lost in their torment. Look at him. Look at the crack. He is not invincible. Her voice steadied him, cutting through the storm. He lifted his gaze to the collector, and for the first time, he noticed the faint tremor in the figure's stance, the way the cracks in his porcelain mask widened slowly, leaking more and more of that writhing light. The anchor's destruction had wounded him, perhaps more deeply than he wanted to admit. The collector tilted his head, as though reading Jonathan's revelation. His voice came soft and venomous, dripping with mockery. So you mean to strike me? Fool! Do you not see? Every blow you land only opens the gate wider. You will not kill me, Jonathan, you will release me. And when you do, I will be bound to nothing. Not porcelain. Not flesh. Not stone. I will be everywhere. I will be everyone. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his knuckles white on the crowbar. The chamber shuddered, dust raining down in heavy clumps, cracks spidering across the ceiling. He could feel time thinning, choices narrowing. He remembered the lattice in the attic, the way it had weakened when smeared with his blood. Blood, it had disrupted the symbols before. Could his own essence be the key, not just to breaking but to binding? His thoughts raced, wild, half-formed, but they were all he had. With a ragged breath, Jonathan made his decision. He lunged forward, crowbar raised high, not toward the chamber walls and not toward the shelves, but straight at the collector's chest. If the cracks in the mask leaked light, then perhaps driving iron and flesh together could pierce deeper, could carry his own blood into the core of that impossible form. Not destruction, not release, but a binding. The collector's eyes flared, the cracks glowing white-hot as Jonathan closed the distance. No, the voice thundered, shaking the chamber. Shadows whipped outward, claws lashing to stop him, but Jonathan barreled through, pain searing his arms and ribs as the darkness tore at his flesh. He roared, the crowbar descending with every shred of will left in his battered body. The iron tip struck the collector's chest dead center. There was no sound of metal on porcelain this time. Instead, the impact reverberated like a bell, a low, resonant toll that shook the chamber and rattled Jonathan's teeth. Light erupted in a geyser from the crack, pouring outward in violent arcs, searing through the shelves, igniting the dolls into incandescent bursts. Jonathan screamed as the crowbar sank deeper, his palms flayed by the scorching heat, his blood spattering across the fissures and vanishing as though drunk by the hungry light. The collector's body convulsed, his arms flailing wildly, shadows splintering apart into smoke and shrieks. His mask split fully, crumbling in shards that fell to the ground with hollow clinks. What lay beneath was no face, only a swirling vortex of light and darkness, writhing with countless distorted shapes. Hands, eyes, mouths, souls fused together into an ever-churning storm. They reached outward, clawing, desperate, 1,000 voices shrieking in harmony. Jonathan's heart nearly gave out at the sight. He had not pierced a man, he had pierced a wound in reality itself. And yet, through the unbearable terror, he drove the crowbar deeper, blood pouring from his hands, his strength ebbing with each second. He thought he might black out, might collapse into the maelstrom himself. But the auburn-haired voice whispered once more, steady, insistent, hold. Don't let go. Bind him with what is left of you. Jonathan clenched his teeth and refused to release the crowbar. The light swallowed everything. Jonathan's vision burned white, his eyes useless, the world reduced to raw brilliance and the roar of countless voices. The crowbar seared in his hands, no longer cold iron but a conduit of fire and pain, its shaft vibrating with inhuman energy. He could feel the collector's body, or what passed for a body, splintering beneath him, not shattering outward but collapsing inward, as though the crowbar had punctured a dam and now the flood poured through him, dragging him with it. Every nerve in his body screamed as the force yanked at his flesh, his bones, his very soul, pulling him toward the vortex that churned where the collector's heart should be. He tried to let go, to release the crowbar, but his hands would not obey. The metal had fused to his palms, blood sealing them into grotesque union. The harder he pulled, the deeper the light dug into him, threads of brilliance snaking up his arms, weaving beneath his skin. He staggered, knees buckling, but the pull only intensified, inexorable, relentless. Behind him, the chamber wailed with chaos, the shelves of dolls exploding one after another in showers of porcelain shards, their captive voices shrieking as they funneled into the maelstrom. The ground split in jagged fissures, glowing from within like veins of molten rock, and the ceiling dripped dust and broken stone as if the entire house were being swallowed alive. Through the storm, Jonathan felt them. The souls. Hundreds, thousands, clawing through the vortex, latching onto him as they were drawn in. They brushed his mind like icy fingers, stabbing images into his brain, faces contorted in agony, families torn apart, murders, betrayals, centuries of misery compressed into fragments of memory that weren't his. He staggered under the weight of it, his chest heaving, his heart lurching as though it might burst. Their cries filled him from the inside, threatening to drown his identity beneath their hunger. "Join us, feed us, save us, die with us." Jonathan screamed, a raw, animal sound, fighting to hold on to himself. His memories became his only weapon. He clung to them desperately, summoning every scrap of his life, his sister's laughter when they were children, his mother's hands smoothing his hair after nightmares, the first time he held an antique clock and felt the weight of history in his palms. He even clung to the loneliness, the regrets, the years of obsession that had led him here. They were his, and he refused to surrender them to this writhing tide. And then, piercing the cacophony, the auburn-haired soul's voice surged again. Clearer now, stronger than before, as though the maelstrom amplified her instead of erasing her. "Jonathan. Do not resist it, direct it. You cannot fight the tide, but you can steer it. Give it shape. Bind him." Her words struck through the haze, sparking something in his mind. He couldn't overpower the collector, not directly. But what if he could twist the curse against itself? The crowbar was not just iron anymore, it was a bridge, linking him to the vortex, to the screaming storm of souls. If he poured himself into that bridge, not just his body, but his essence, then maybe he could weave the flood into a binding instead of being consumed by it. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was the only choice left. With a roar that tore his throat raw, Jonathan stopped fighting the pull and pushed instead. He leaned into the crowbar, forcing not just his strength but his soul into it, bleeding his memories into the torrent. He imagined his blood, his life, seeping through the cracks of the collector's chest, staining the light, forcing it into new patterns. For a heartbeat, he saw them, strands of energy twisting, knotting into shapes that resembled the lattice upstairs, but more intricate, older, alive. A binding not of wood or stone, but of essence itself. The collector shrieked, a sound so piercing it rattled the bones of the earth. His form convulsed, cracking wider, the mask face shattering entirely to reveal nothing but the howling vortex within. His arms flailed, shadows thrashing, trying to pry the crowbar loose, but Jonathan held firm, his muscles tearing, his vision blackening at the edges. Every second felt like eternity, his body a candle burning down to nothing. The doll's screams reached their crescendo. One by one, they burst apart in showers of porcelain dust, their captive voices funneling into the storm. Jonathan felt each one pass through him, some cold and hateful, others warm with gratitude, all of them carving scars into his soul as they went. He wanted to collapse, to surrender, but he held on, clinging to the auburn-haired soul's whisper. "Almost. Hold." The ground heaved violently, the chamber tearing itself apart, shelves crumbling into the fissures. Dust and stone rained down, but Jonathan barely noticed. He was part of the storm now, his body half dissolved in light, his blood dripping upward into the maelstrom instead of down onto the floor. His skin blistered, his veins glowed, and still he pushed, driving the crowbar deeper, forcing the chaotic torrent into knots, into bindings, into a cage of blood and will. And then, impact. A final, blinding surge. The vortex contracted, screaming, folding in on itself like a collapsing star. The light imploded into the collector's chest, dragging Jonathan with it. For one impossible moment, he felt himself suspended between two fates, consumed into the curse forever, or burning himself away to seal it. The silence struck first. After the storm of screams, the violent implosion of light, and the sound of the house tearing itself apart, the absence of noise was unbearable. Jonathan lay sprawled on a cold surface, every breath rasping as if through a throat full of glass. His body felt wrong, heavier in some places, weightless in others, as though he were stitched together from mismatched pieces. For long minutes, he couldn't move, paralyzed by the fear that if he did, he would discover he no longer had a body at all. Only when his lungs screamed for more air did he finally shift, rolling onto his side with a groan that echoed strangely, too loud for the stillness. The floor beneath him was smooth, not stone, not wood, something colder, polished like glass but faintly yielding, like walking on ice that flexed before cracking. When he pushed himself upright, the space around him stretched into endless shadow, broken only by thin lines of light crisscrossing in geometric lattices overhead, like the inverted skeleton of the Dollmaker's workshop. The bindings. His bindings. They pulsed faintly red, as though veins of his blood had been woven into their construction, glowing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Each pulse was accompanied by a dull ache in his chest, as if something vital had been stolen and strung across the dark ceiling. Jonathan stumbled forward, every step ringing hollow. He expected debris, the remnants of shattered dolls or splintered shelves, but there was nothing. The chamber was gone. The house was gone. He was adrift in a void that stretched too far to measure, a void where even the concept of walls or corners felt irrelevant. His breath fogged in front of him, though there was no cold, and when he spoke his own name under his breath, Jonathan, the sound didn't echo back. It was swallowed whole, devoured by the darkness. And then, faintly, movement. A flicker in the blackness, like porcelain eyes catching light. He froze, heart hammering, his fingers instinctively reaching for the crowbar. But his hands met only empty air. The weapon, fused to his palms moments before, was gone. His skin bore the burns where metal had seared into flesh, but the crowbar itself had vanished, as though it had been absorbed into the bindings, into the void itself. Naked now, unarmed, he forced himself to take another step forward. The floor rippled beneath him like water yet did not break. The flicker came again, closer this time. A whisper followed it, soft, feminine, threaded with despair. "You held it together, for now." Jonathan turned, searching the void, and there she was. The auburn-haired soul. Only now, she was no longer a faint shimmer or a disembodied whisper. She stood before him, her figure translucent but detailed, a woman in a dress decades out of fashion, her eyes pools of sorrow, her lips pale and trembling. She looked more alive than any of the voices he had heard, and yet she was clearly not living. Her edges wavered, as though she might dissolve at any moment, but her gaze was steady, piercing, fixed on him. "You've bound him," she said softly, her voice carrying with unnatural clarity. "The collector is caged, for now. But you didn't escape untouched. You couldn't. No one ever does." Jonathan staggered back a step, his throat dry. "Where am I?" The words tore from him, desperate. "What happened to the house? To me?" She tilted her head, almost pitying. "You're in the hollow between. Not alive, not dead. Not free, not captive. You poured yourself into the binding, Jonathan. The curse needed a heart to anchor it. And you gave yours." The words sank into him like knives. His heartbeat thudded painfully in his ears, as if in confirmation. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the sluggish throb of something that no longer felt wholly his. Every pulse seemed weaker than the last, stretched thin across the void, tethered to those glowing lines overhead. A wave of nausea washed over him, and with it the horrifying realization that she was right, he wasn't entirely alive anymore. He was part of the lattice. The woman stepped closer, her form flickering, her voice low. You have days, maybe hours before you decide what to become. Stay tethered here, and you'll bind the collector forever. But you will cease to be Jonathan. You'll dissolve, thread by thread, into the curse. Or, her eyes darkened, a shadow sweeping across her features. Or you'll take his place. Jonathan's stomach turned. His place? Her gaze sharpened, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from all around him. The collector isn't dead. He never dies. He only trades faces. If you loosen your grip on the binding, if you allow yourself to slip into the hollow's hunger, it will shape you into him. You will wear his mask. His hunger will be yours. And every soul that wanders too close will feed your curse. The floor beneath Jonathan shuddered faintly, like the surface of a drum struck from below. Far off in the void, the flicker of porcelain eyes returned, this time dozens of them, blinking open in unison, their glassy stares fixed on him. The dolls. They hadn't been destroyed. They had followed him here, carried into the hollow, their faces rearranged into strange new expressions. Some smiled, some sobbed, but all stared, waiting. Jonathan's chest tightened, his breath shallow. The choice pressed against him like a vice. Sacrifice himself to bind the collector forever, or surrender to the hollow and become the very thing he fought to destroy. There was no middle ground. No escape. Only damnation in two forms. But before he could speak, before he could even take in the weight of it, the void itself shifted. The lattice above them quivered violently, one of its glowing strands snapping with a sound like tearing flesh. The auburn-haired woman gasped, clutching her throat as her form flickered. It's too soon, he's already straining against you. If he breaks free now, there will be nothing left to stop him. Her eyes, wide with urgency, locked on his. Jonathan, you must choose. The porcelain eyes in the distance blinked closer, the dolls advancing silently across the black floor, their little feet making no sound. Each one bore the faintest smile, as though they already knew which choice he would make. The void trembled like a living thing, its lattice unraveling strand by strand, each break echoing like the snap of bone. Jonathan stood at its center, his chest heaving, his heart sputtering between two rhythms, one his own, weak and human, the other alien, steady, eternal, and hungry. The dolls crept closer across the black floor, their glass eyes unblinking, their painted lips curved into knowing smiles. Some dragged their porcelain feet, fractured but unbroken, their cracks glowing faintly with the same red light that pulsed in the bindings above. They were not merely dolls anymore. They were watching vessels, awaiting his choice. The auburn-haired woman staggered before him, her outline fraying like smoke in the wind. Her eyes glistened with sorrow as she whispered, Jonathan, you can still hold him. Bind him forever. Your essence can hold the curse in place until it burns itself to dust. She reached toward him, her hand trembling. But you must let go of yourself. You'll dissolve into nothing, your name, your memories, gone. You'll be only the cage. Do you understand? Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat raw, his voice rasping. And the other way? Her face darkened, her outline shuddering as though the question itself hurt her. If you let the hollow take you, you'll become him. The collector will not return wearing his mask, you will. His hunger will be yours, his eternity yours. Every soul that strays too near will be consumed. You'll walk among the living with a smile not your own, collecting, feeding, never ending. And worst of all, her voice cracked. You'll believe it was always you. The words cut him deeper than any blade. He looked down at his hands, scarred and burned from the crowbar, trembling as if weighed with invisible chains. Around him, the dolls had formed a circle, their heads tilting in perfect synchronization, their smiles widening. Some of them bore faint traces of familiarity, the curve of a lip, the angle of a jaw. He recognized faces. The old man from the antique shop. The child whose missing poster he had seen stapled to a telephone pole. Even the auburn-haired woman herself, her porcelain double smiling among the others. They all waited, their glass eyes shimmering with anticipation, as though Jonathan's choice was already carved into fate. The bindings above groaned, another strand snapping free, the lattice sagging. From the tear spilled a sound, a low, guttural growl, neither voice nor wind, but something older, deeper. The collector was pressing through, fighting to reclaim the hollow. Jonathan's knees buckled, his chest searing as his heart stuttered against the strain. He knew the woman was right. Time was gone. The choice was no longer distant. It was now, and it was his. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered to himself, "I never wanted this. I just wanted to hold history in my hands. To feel less alone." His voice broke, ragged and small in the dark. But history held me instead. The dolls leaned closer, their tiny mouths opening in unison. A single whisper hissed out, layered with hundreds of voices, male and female, young and old, all overlapping, "Choose." Jonathan closed his eyes. His mind flickered with memories, his sister's laugh, his mother's touch, the warmth of being human. He clung to them fiercely, but they slipped like sand through his fingers, fading, already bleeding into the lattice above. The auburn-haired woman's voice pressed close, urgent. "Bind him, Jonathan. Please. Don't let the world suffer what I have suffered." His lips parted, his decision trembling on the edge. But then, something shifted inside him. A realization, cruel and sharp, that stole the breath from his lungs. The binding would never truly end the curse. He had felt it in the lattice, seen it in the way the strands strained and bled. The curse did not die, it only waited. If he bound it, it would only bide its time until the cage weakened, until another fool stumbled upon it. He would give his soul, yes, but the curse would not burn away. It would simply hunger in silence until another Jonathan came along. And in that moment, something darker rose within him. A thought he should never have allowed, but which spread like fire through his veins. What if I did better than him? What if I didn't hide in shadows, waiting, starving? What if I fed with purpose, with precision? What if the curse could be controlled? His eyes snapped open, and they no longer glistened with tears. They glowed faintly, porcelain bright, reflecting the doll's hollow stares. The auburn-haired woman gasped, stumbling back as if she could already see what he had chosen. "No, Jonathan, no!" But his lips curved into a smile, slow and unnatural, not his own. He stepped forward, his body moving with a fluidity that felt alien, yet natural, as though it had always been waiting for this moment. The dolls bowed their heads in unison, welcoming him into their circle. The lattice above screamed as it tore completely apart, collapsing into nothing, yet Jonathan stood untouched at its center, the void reshaping itself around him. He reached out, brushing his burned fingers against the cheek of the porcelain version of the auburn-haired woman. The doll's smile widened, and in her glass eyes, he saw himself, not Jonathan, not collector, but something new. Something hungrier. His voice was calm, steady, terrifying in its certainty. "Every doll has a soul. And now, every soul will be mine." The void folded inward, snapping shut like a coffin lid. Months later, in a quiet Midwestern town, a little girl wandered into an antique shop on Main Street. Her parents browsed the shelves idly, but the girl's attention was caught by a doll displayed in the corner, an exquisite piece, lifelike, with auburn hair and a painted smile that seemed just a little too real. She leaned closer, entranced. The shopkeeper, a tall man with strangely bright eyes and a warm smile, knelt beside her, resting one hand on her shoulder. "Careful," he whispered kindly, his tone both gentle and commanding. "Every doll has a soul. But some are still hungry." The girl giggled nervously, not understanding, while her parents called her away. But as they left the shop, the man lingered in the doorway, watching them go. Behind him, dozens of dolls lined the shelves, their glass eyes gleaming in the afternoon light, their lips frozen in silent, eternal smiles. And as he turned back inside, the door creaked shut with the sound of inevitability. The curse had not ended. It had only begun again, wearing a new face.